Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai whakatau mai. Whakatau mai I roti tēnei upurangi, I roti tēnei kaupapa ko te wero o te moana nui a kiwa. Me tīmata I roti I te karakia. A whakataka te hau ki turu, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki ita, kia mā taratara ki tai. Kia hi a kiana te atākura he tia, ika he hauhunga tihei mauri ora. Tā tātou nei mihi, ki tā tātou nei kaihanga, huri no ki te kingi Māori ko kingi tū heitia, o te tau te whirowhiro te tuawhitu, huri no ki te hungara tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou ngā hau e whā o te ao, I roto I tēnei kaupapa, te wero, te mātauranga o tēnei kaupapa. To everybody that's joining us, I acknowledge you, and as we open our proceedings, bless this proceedings and what will happen with the dawn, red-tip dawn that rises. We welcome you here to the University of Waikato, which is hosting this kaupapa, the Challenge of the Pacific, for today. We acknowledge all of you from across the world who will be speaking in different parts of the day, and especially to those who have convened us today. Kia koe, Professor Gillespie, huri no ki te kaiwhakahaere ko Sir Jim McLay, tēnā koutou. Acknowledging those who are hosting us and will lead this proceedings. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, welcome.
My thanks to Whetū Tākamo for that welcome in Te Reo Māori, the language of New Zealand's indigenous Maori people. To all peoples, powers and nations, to all voices, greetings, greetings, greetings. E na mana, e na reo, e na iwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Jim McLay, and I'm your Master of Ceremonies for this virtual conference. I particularly welcome you to the PA, a recently opened landmark building at the very heart of the University of Waikato. The PA was shown in our opening slides, and it's behind me as I speak. It describes a Maori village or a defensive site or settlement. The PA is our meeting place today. On behalf of Te Parenga Faculty of Law at the Waikato University and the Policy Institute at King's College London, I'm pleased to welcome you to this conference, China and the Pacific. This occasion, this virtual conference, was planned over 3 years ago and is in no way coincident with the fact that this week Pacific Island leaders are meeting in Washington, D.C. with the Biden administration. This is the 12th of 20 conferences hosted at quarterly intervals by academic institutions and think tanks around the world. Although this conference is based in Hamilton, New Zealand, the event is virtual. Its proceedings will be recorded and will be subsequently streamed. There is no public audience, but I must acknowledge the online attendance of the Right Honourable Sir Oliver Letwin, a former British Cabinet Minister, now of King's College London, author of the 221 book, New China versus America, A Warning, at whose initiative this project and those virtual conferences have been organised. These conferences are part of the Project for Peaceful Competition promoted by Sir Oliver. It seeks to initiate serious thinking about the many challenges to which the West must respond to achieve cooperation with the East, particularly with China. The intention is to develop ways of working together to solve common problems and ways of building trust between China and the West, thereby reducing the risks of confrontation. The website provides a fuller description of the project, particularly of the institutions that are hosting the 20 conferences, and also information about the Global Advisory Panel that is seeking to steer the project. There will be 2 consecutive sessions. The first will provide a perspective from 5 politicians and diplomats who have direct and relevant regional experience, particularly reflecting different interests and focusing on the opportunities and challenges that are posed in the coming decades by the role of China in the Pacific. The second session will involve 4 professors of international relations or international law from different New Zealand universities. They will provide comments on the theme of the conference and also on matters raised in the first session. Each participant will speak to the same broad question, how they see the challenge of the Pacific. They've also been asked to submit a written overview to supplement their verbal remarks, and these will be posted online with the other conference proceedings. For the first session, we are privileged to have contributions from 4 diplomats and from a senior politician. The speakers will be Ambassador Wang Xiaolong, Ambassador from the People's Republic of China to New Zealand; Ambassador Tom Udall, Ambassador of the United States of America to New Zealand; Ambassador Nina Obermaier, European Union Ambassador to New Zealand; High Commissioner Taliaferro, the Independent State of Samoa's High Commissioner to New Zealand; and the Honourable Gerry Brownlee MP, Member of the New Zealand Parliament and Opposition Spokesperson on Foreign Affairs. They will be followed immediately by the second session entitled The Academic View, with 4 academic speakers from New Zealand universities. Professor Robert Patman, Director of International Studies at the University of Otago; Dr. Anna Powles of the Centre for Defence and Security Studies at Massey University, who will be joining us from Washington, D.C. Professor Steven Ratuva, Director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies at the University of Canterbury, and Professor Alexander Gillespie, Professor of Law at the University of Waikato. Now, in the interest of time, I trust that participants will forgive me if I introduce them only briefly with reference to their current roles, but their CVs will be posted fully online. And again, in the interest of time and reflecting the fact that we participate from a distance, everyone has been asked to stay within a time allocation, and if necessary, a bell will indicate that we are in the last minute of each presentation. As this is not a debate, all participants will speak without interruption. It is now my privilege to call on Ambassador Wang Xiaolong, Ambassador from the People's Republic of China to New Zealand. Ambassador.
Sir Jim, Honourable MP Gerry Brownlee, my fellow ambassadors, Tom, Nina, High Commissioner Taliaferro, friends of the academia, good afternoon, and for those of you in London, good morning. It's a pleasure and privilege to join you today virtually to discuss the challenges facing the Pacific region, a topic of common interest to us. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the organizers of this event, the Te Paringa Faculty of Law, Waikato University, and the Policy Institute of King's College London for their efforts to bring us together. Indeed, enhanced exchanges among major Pacific Island partners, players, and stakeholders are conducive to building confidence and common understanding, expanding cooperation, and tackling common challenges. Nowadays, Pacific Island countries are working with an increasing number of partners to make their Pacific voice heard on various platforms. As a result, they are playing an increasingly important role in addressing climate change, achieving sustainable development, and maintaining peace and stability in this region and beyond. For this and other reasons, the Pacific region has received growing interest and attention from the international community. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you the state of China's long-standing relations with the Pacific Island countries and our views on relevant Pacific issues. I also look forward to hearing your perspectives on this. Let me first briefly touch on the history of China's evolving relations with the Pacific Island countries. China's friendly interactions with the Pacific Island countries have a long history, which can be dated back to hundreds of years ago. 150 years ago, a number of Chinese people crossed the vast ocean to reach the South Pacific Islands. They settled down, worked hard, and mingled with the local community and lived in harmony with them. And they forged strong cultural and people-to-people bonds across the Pacific. In fact, I've been told during my visits, because I'm doubling also as ambassador to the Cook Islands in Niue, during my visits to these island countries, I've been told a number of times by my Polynesian friends that their ancestors may have come from China. Our official relationship with the Pacific Island countries is almost as old as our relationship with Australia and New Zealand, starting in the 1970s, bringing China's relations with the region onto a fast track. In 1975, we established diplomatic relations with Fiji and Samoa, and with Papua New Guinea in 1976, with Vanuatu in 1982, with Micronesia in 1989, just to name a few. So far, we have established diplomatic relations with 10 Pacific Island countries and set up resident embassies in 8 of them. In the following decades since, China and the Pacific Island countries have deepened relations on all fronts. In November 2014, President Xi Jinping paid a state visit to Fiji and held a collective meeting with leaders of PICs having diplomatic relations with us, when the two sides agreed to establish a strategic partnership featuring mutual respect and common development. In November 2018, President Xi paid a state visit to Papua New Guinea and had another collective meeting with leaders of the 10 PICs, when China PIC's relations were elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership of mutual respect and common development. These two visits helped open a new chapter in all-dimensional cooperation between the two sides. In recent years, China and PICs have also jointly built the China PIC's Foreign Ministers meeting mechanism. Last year, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi was invited to visit South Pacific Island countries and chaired the second China Pacific Island countries Foreign Ministers meeting, where he announced that China will continue to strengthen the 6 cooperation platforms covering emergency supplies, climate change, poverty reduction, disaster prevention, agriculture, and application of Juncao technology, all tailored to the PIC's needs, taking China PIC's practical cooperation to new levels. Let me turn now to the objectives and principles of China's relations with the Pacific Island countries. To put it simply, the fundamental goal of China's relations with the PICs is to achieve common development. Both China and the Pacific Island countries are developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region and share similar historical experiences of being victims to invasion and colonization. We all give first priority to economic and social development to improve people's lives. As the largest developing country, China emphasized deeply PIC's colonial past and their aspirations for development, and has actively helped PICs within the framework of South-South cooperation to address common challenges, including climate change, poverty reduction, and sustainable development. While working with Pacific Island countries, we have followed the principles of sincerity, practical results, affinity, good faith, and pursuing the greater good and shared interests, the core of which is mutual respect. Recently, when meeting with Prime Minister Sagharovi of the Solomon Islands, President Xi Jinping presented China's 4 full respects policy towards Pacific Island countries. First, China fully respects the sovereignty and independence of Pacific Island countries. It has a long-standing and consistent position that all countries, big or small, rich or poor, strong or weak, are equal. China never bullies others or interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. We always respect the development paths independently chosen by other countries, including those by the people of the Pacific Island countries, and support their sovereign decision to conduct normal cooperation with other countries. Meanwhile, we appreciated deeply that the 10 PICs having diplomatic relations with us always adhere to the One China principle, understand and support our core interests and major concerns on the Taiwan question. Second, China fully respects the will of the Pacific Island countries. We understand the severe challenges they face on addressing climate change, promoting development, and improving people's lives. By planning together, working together, and benefiting together, China seeks to promote PIC's infrastructure development and poverty reduction so as to help them break the development bottlenecks and enhance their own development capacity, including achieving long-term financial and, above all, economic viability and sustainability. Third, China fully respects the culture and traditions of Pacific Island countries. We never consider the culture of any country to be superior to those of others. Each and every culture is unique and equal, and all are part and parcel of the world civilization garden. We follow the principle of harmony without unanimity in interacting with Pacific Island countries, and have drawn on and learned from each other's cultures to flourish and prosper together. Fourth, China fully respects Pacific Islands countries to seek strength through unity and supports them in implementing the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. In this respect, we have taken the initiative to align the Belt and Road Cooperation and various China PIC cooperation mechanisms with the goals and objectives, as well as the priority areas of the 2050 strategy, in order to support PICs to build a peaceful, harmonious, secure, inclusive, and prosperous Blue Pacific, as outlined in its 2050 strategy with the Pacific approach. China is a staunch supporter of open regionalism led and owned by the Pacific countries. We respect the existing cooperation mechanisms and arrangements in the region and value the dialogues and exchanges with authoritative regional organizations such as the Pacific Islands Forum. Our bilateral and multilateral cooperation with Pacific Island countries is complementary and non-exclusive vis-à-vis these existing regional mechanisms. In 1989, China became one of the first official dialogue partners of the Forum. Since 1990, we have sent government representatives to attend 31 consecutive post-Forum dialogues and has explored and carried out extensive practical cooperation in the region. China has long supported the role and work of the PIF Secretariat and has proactively provided assistance to the Secretariat within our capacity. Last year, we donated over $1 million US dollars to the Secretariat. This came on top of past donations of similar amounts. China also strongly supports the PIF Leaders Meeting and has provided support to Forum chairs in hosting Forum summits and related meetings, including the immediate past chair, Fiji, and the current chair, the Cook Islands. We look forward to new progress being made in the upcoming Forum Leaders Meeting and Forum Partners Dialogue under the stewardship of the Cook Islands this year. Now I would like to highlight some examples of exchanges and cooperation between China and PICs. China always honors our commitment and puts money where our mouth is. More importantly, our efforts didn't start yesteryear. We have been doing it for decades. The two sides have conducted frequent exchanges at different levels and established multiple bilateral and multilateral dialogue mechanisms. Now, the cooperation between the two sides have expanded to more than 20 areas, including trade, investment, ocean affairs, environmental protection, climate change, disaster preparedness, response and mitigation, poverty alleviation, healthcare, education, tourism, culture, sports, etc. China is an important economic and trade partner of PICs, and the two-way trade has continued to grow. According to statistics of the Chinese side, from 1992 to 2021, total trade volume between China and PICs having diplomatic relations with us registered an average annual increase of 13% and expanded by over 30 times in 30 years. We have signed Belt and Road Cooperation MOUs with all the 10 PICs having relations with us. We have enhanced economic and technical cooperation under the framework of South-South cooperation, including implementing nearly 500 grant and concessional funding, technical assistance, in-kind donation projects in PICs, helping build important infrastructure such as roads, bridges, wharves, hospitals, schools, and sports facilities, and training about 10,000 professionals in various fields. We take the PIC's special conditions and concerns in relation to climate change very seriously, and has been committed to helping them strengthen capacity and resilience. Since 2019, we have held 4 South-South cooperation training sessions for PICs under the theme of tackling climate change for green and low carbon development, and provided multiple batches of supplies. In April 2022, the China PIC's Climate Change Cooperation Center was officially launched. Additionally, we have attached great importance to strengthening renewable energy cooperation with PICs. The photovoltaic power plant project in Samoa, built by a Chinese company in 2010, was China's first such cooperation project in the region. Meanwhile, China has been devoted to promoting the full and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement so as to help PICs strengthen climate resilience. In recent years, we have hosted multiple seminars for PIC officials focusing on environmental protection and management, water pollution treatment, and water resource protection, which aims to help PICs improve environmental protection and marine resource management capability and jointly crack down on IUU fishing activities. In 2017, we hosted the China Small Islands States Ocean-Related Ministerial Roundtable with the theme of blue economy and ecological islands. In 2021, the first China PIC's Forum on Fishery Cooperation and Development was held in Guangzhou, China, where the Guangzhou Consensus was reached to deepen relevant cooperation. In 2023, the China PIC Agriculture and Fisheries Ministers meeting was held in China. All of these are conducive to deepening fishery cooperation between the two sides and help PICs to achieve sustainable development. After the outbreak of COVID-19, China moved quickly to share information about epidemic prevention and control, diagnosis and treatment with PIC's public health authorities, and held more than 10 bilateral or multilateral public health expert meetings online with PICs having diplomatic relations with us. Moreover, in order to render PICs our utmost assistance in fighting the pandemic, we set up the China Pacific Island Countries Anti-COVID-19 Cooperation Fund, established the China Pacific Island Countries Reserve for emergency supplies, and provided PICs with hundreds of thousands of doses of vaccines and over 100 tons of supplies. In short, the cooperation between China and PICs has proved to be responsive to the needs of the PICs, bringing tangible and material benefits to the peoples of the region, setting a fine example of win-win cooperation among countries of different regions, sizes, and systems. Finally, I would like to elaborate a bit on one of the fundamental beliefs underpinning our foreign policy, that win-win cooperation is the ultimate solution to challenges facing all of us. According to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, China has been consistently pursuing and expanding global partnerships based on equality, openness, and cooperation, and broadening the convergence of interests with other countries, either in the South Pacific or other parts of the world. China's relationships never target any third party. Conversely, nor should they be subjected to interference by any third party. China respects the connections that PICs have established with other countries. We have no interest in engaging in geopolitical competition with anyone, nor do we support using competition to define interstate relations, because by definition, there will always be winners and losers in a competition. In the value system of China, the relationship between countries should never be a zero-sum game, but rather be based on mutual respect, equality, win-win cooperation, openness, and inclusiveness, so as to better cooperate to address common challenges and achieve common development. China values international and regional peace and stability, and has been working unyieldingly to that end. To better respond to PIC's wishes and needs, we're open to working with all interested parties to take stock of what existing trilateral or even multilateral cooperation has achieved, to explore more cooperation of such kind to the benefits of all sides. We're against coercing countries into choosing sides, against forming exclusive and even divisive military alliances, targeting third countries, and provoking military confrontation, and against efforts at militarization of the Pacific region, let alone bring nuclear weapons or nuclear pollution into the Pacific region, which will undermine the regional environment for development and threaten regional peace and stability. In recent years, with a view to addressing the global deficits in peace, development, security, and governance, China has successively put forward the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, sharing Chinese approach to solve global challenges and build a community with a shared future for mankind. China is ready to work with all parties inside and outside the Pacific region to advance the implementation of the three major global initiatives so as to better safeguard peace and stability and achieve common development in the Pacific and the wider world. To conclude, living in a world undergoing profound and accelerating changes unseen in a century, we need to work together in solidarity more than ever before. What I want to emphasize is that no matter how the international landscape changes, the purpose of China's foreign policy to pursue world peace and promote common development will never change. Our sincerity and mutual respect towards PICs will never change, and our determination to learn from each other and achieve common development will never change. China is always ready to work with PICs and all other interested partners who genuinely care about PIC's development to enhance mutual political trust, expand practical cooperation, and deepen people-to-people exchanges so as to build a path of peace, cooperation, development, and prosperity across the Pacific. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those comments, which are properly recorded. I will now call upon Ambassador Tom Udall, Ambassador of the United States of America to New Zealand.
Thank you so much, and let me just say it's a pleasure to be on a panel here with my friends from the Diplomatic Corps, the Chinese ambassador, the EU ambassador, and also the Right Honourable Gerry Brownlee. I'd also like to acknowledge the key organizers of this program, including Alexander Gillespie, Sir Oliver Litwin, and Sir Jim McLay. This month, Secretary Blinken outlined the U.S. vision of the future at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Our vision for the future, a world that is open, free, prosperous, and secure. That vision is not America's alone, but the enduring aspiration of the people in every nation on every continent. A world where individuals are free in their daily lives and can shape their own futures, their communities, and their countries. A world where every nation can choose its own path and its own partners. A world where goods, ideas, and individuals can flow freely and lawfully across land, sea, sky, and cyberspace, where technology is used to empower people, not to divide, surveil, and repress them. A world where the global economy is defined by fair competition, openness, transparency, and where prosperity is not measured only in how much countries' economies grow, but how many people share in that growth. A world that generates a race to the top in labor and environmental standards, in health, education, infrastructure, technology, security, and opportunity. A world where international law and the core principles of the UN Charter are upheld and where universal human rights are respected. It is our belief that much of the history of the 21st century will be written in this vitally important region. Developments in one corner of this vast region can have dramatic effects elsewhere. On a more granular level, our goal is to build the collective capacity of like-minded allies, partners, and friends, so as to advance shared priorities and bolster the rules-based regional order from which we all have benefited. And in the Pacific, we must ensure that this is a race to the top. As in the United States and my home state of New Mexico, people throughout this region want to ensure their families are cared for and can fulfill their goals and potential. We can only do this by working together to uphold and improve the rules-based international system that has been fundamental to regional security and stability. The international rules-based system has pulled so many out of poverty and created the innovative world we live in today. But we know some people have been left behind, and we must strive to lift everyone up. We must work together to revitalize and improve our global institutions. We're determined to work with any country, including those with whom we disagree on important issues, so long as they want to deliver for their citizens, contribute to solving shared challenges, and uphold the international norms that we build together. Under Secretary Yellen's leadership, we're making a major push to revitalize and reform the multilateral development banks. We want to ensure they can meet the pressing needs of low and middle-income countries who are facing a perfect storm of challenges: the growing impact of climate crisis, economic fallout from COVID, inflation, and crushing debt. We are working through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to build resilient supply chains, improve trade flows, combat corruption, and promote clean energy, decarbonization, and infrastructure. But our policies and actions are not carried out in a vacuum. Our leaders are equally committed to engaging in listening to the challenges and solutions of others, especially here in the Pacific. The Pacific is a dynamic region full of diversity, people, thoughts, and approaches, full of solutions and people tackling the most pressing global daily issues. We will continue to open embassies across the region to ensure our leadership in Washington has a direct line to these ideas and solutions. As part of listening, engaging, and consulting with our Pacific friends, this month we established diplomatic relations with Cook Islands and Niue, and President Biden hosted Pacific Island leaders at the second U.S. PIF Summit. We are also aligning our efforts and strategies to help the Pacific region achieve its specified objectives as outlined in the PIF's 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. We support Pacific regionalism with a strong Pacific Islands Forum at its center. And through the Partners in the Blue Pacific initiative, we are working to coordinate partnerships in the region. This initiative has already engendered several lines of effort. For example, Pacific humanitarian warehousing to pre-position humanitarian and emergency supplies, as agreed by PIF ministers at the inaugural Pacific Disaster Risk Reduction Ministers meeting held in Nadi. An annual Pacific Cyber Capacity Conference, further support to the Pacific Climate Change Center in Samoa, support to access climate finance, and we look to the future. We are committed to engaging a wide range of partners, including the Pacific region, to forge an international consensus that can harness the potential of emerging technologies like AI while minimizing risk. I would also like to take this opportunity to dispel some misinformation. We're not trying to contain China. We do not seek a new Cold War with China. We're not asking partners to choose between ourselves and China. And most certainly, we do not seek conflict with China. When we talk about competition, that does not mean conflict. When we talk about competition, we're talking about putting forth our vision for the future, which upholds democratic values and the rules-based international system. From a U.S. perspective, competition with China wasn't inevitable. We tried to be positive with the PRC. We embraced them and welcomed them into the international system. However, when any country, including China, challenges aspects of an internationally established system that has brought stability and economic growth across the globe, we will call them out and present our views in a peaceful and transparent manner. As such, President Biden has been clear about our strategy, which remains to invest, align, and compete. We are investing in the foundations of our strength at home, aligning with partners and allies on our approach abroad, and harnessing two key assets to compete with the PRC to defend our interests and build our vision for the future. We believe working with a network of allies and partners allow us to manage our competition with China from a position of strength, speaking clearly, credibly, and with a chorus of friends about our concerns. Open lines of communications also help reduce risks of miscalculations, which our leaders are committed to maintaining. We want an international environment that makes it possible for all countries, including the United States and China, to coexist and cooperate without fear of coercion. Fundamentally, the United States and our partners share and represent very different values to that of China. We represent the rules-based order that ensures a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's these values that we will continue to compete on. History has shown that free societies working together are a formidable force. As the world faces new challenges, we believe the only solution is to deepen cooperation and listen to partners, while at the same time presenting our views of the future in a full and transparent manner. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much for those comments, which have been duly recorded and will, of course, appear on the website. It's now my pleasure to invite Ambassador Nina Obermaier, the European Union Ambassador to New Zealand, to speak. Ambassador Obermaier.
Thank you very much. Ngami nui kia koutou katoa, tēnei te miri ki te tangata whenua, Waikato Tainui, kei te mihi ki te whare wānanga o Waikato, University of Waikato, for convening today's discussion. Kei te mihi ki te excellencies, colleagues, distinguished participants in today's discussion. Harikoa te ngako kua tai mai nei. It's a pleasure to be here, even if this takes place only virtually. Looking at the question we've all been asked to answer, as a non-native speaker of English, I was wondering about its intended direction, the challenge of the Pacific. Should I be outlining the challenge of the Pacific from an EU point of view as the challenge faced by the Pacific, or the challenge issued by the Pacific to the European Union and other partners? I decided I will try to do both. As to the challenge faced by the Pacific, it is difficult to address this in singular form. Starting with the most existential of challenges, climate change, to biodiversity, to resilience, to external economic shocks, to shifting geopolitical balances. And my colleagues have spoken to all of these issues already. If the current increase in attention to the region and the proliferation of high-level visits and meetings has demonstrated one thing, it is that the Pacific Island countries have agency that they use, that they make use of, both in a bilateral and in a regional context. I would argue that the challenge issued by the Pacific is that this agency be acknowledged, both in words and in action. I would also argue that the EU has acknowledged and valued this agency for a long time in its partnership with the Pacific region and as a development partner in the Pacific for many decades. In our development work, the EU is led by the priorities of the countries themselves. And my colleague, Ambassador Tom Udall, has been speaking powerfully about the agency and the objectives in the region. And both my colleagues, so both my colleague, the Chinese ambassador, and the US ambassador have spoken about the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent that we all acknowledge as a guiding document for our partnership and cooperation with the Pacific. The strategy that was endorsed by Pacific Islands Forum leaders at the meeting in July 2022, and which identifies as priorities economic development, climate change, oceans and environment, people, technology and connectivity, as well as peace and security. The European Union's commitment for development assistance for the Pacific region since 2050 and running up to 2027 amounts to more than 2.5 billion New Zealand dollars. It focuses on three key priorities. The first being climate action and environmental sustainability. The second, inclusive and sustainable economic development. And the third, fundamental values, human development, peace and security. And you will recognize in our development cooperation priorities, the overlap with the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, as it should be. In response to the most pressing and existential threat of climate change, the European Union has since 2019 made the European Green Deal its flagship policy. It has the objective of making of Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050, and has set ambitious interim targets for 2030. But we don't stop at having this level of ambition for the European Union. We also acknowledge that we've got a responsibility outside of the EU's borders, which is why the EU is the world's largest donor of climate finance and supports developing countries in the development and implementation of national adaptation strategies and plans. We held a successful event on climate adaptation and loss and damage in July 2022, followed by a climate security event in the Pacific region in early 2023. The European Union, the European Investment Bank, and its member states are also the largest donors to the Green Climate Fund, contributing roughly 45% or $4.5 billion to the fund, of which the nine Pacific Island countries have benefited by having project approved for funding under the fund for a total of more than $600 million. This includes grants and co-financing, with actions ranging from urban water supply and wastewater management to coastal adaptation in Tuvalu, to integrated flood management in Samoa, to the Pacific Islands Renewable Energy Investment Program. Projects that have a tangible and direct impact on improving people's lives and on improving resilience to the challenges and threats posed by climate change. Under the European Union's Global Gateway Initiative, the flagship projects in the Pacific are a hydroelectric power plant in Fiji and a feasibility study for a port in Kiribati. This activity on the ground in cooperation with the Pacific Island countries has been matched by the European Union's support also in the context of the UN. In the UN General Assembly, a resolution was passed with the strong support of the EU, initiated by Vanuatu, to secure the request for the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on climate change. We believe that it is crucial to ascertain what the harm caused by climate change has meant for both current and future generations, as well as for those countries that, by virtue of their geographical circumstances and level of development, are injured or specially affected by or are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. This with the objective and the intention to encourage a maximum level of convergence between the measures governments have outlined in their national eco-determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and the actual cuts to greenhouse gas emissions that are required. This resolution comes, of course, also at a pivotal moment in view of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change's 28th Conference of the Parties, so COP28 this November, with the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement as the main event. The EU, in the interest also of the Pacific island countries, but first of all and above all in global interest, intends to use this process to encourage a progressive interpretation and full implementation of the Paris Agreement. UN General Assembly Week is still ongoing as we speak, and the Sustainable Development Goals Summit has put development on top of this year's agenda. Pacific countries might be concerned that the EU's resolve on supporting Ukraine in the face of the illegal and unprovoked aggression by Russia could diminish our engagement with partner countries to address their development challenges. Let me reassure you that these concerns are unfounded. Throughout the war, the EU has not only maintained its development cooperation and humanitarian assistance, it has provided additional contributions to improving global food security in the form of humanitarian assistance, by helping to get grain out of Ukraine, by supporting vulnerable populations, and by stepping up our own food production. And we know that Pacific Island countries are also concerned about the threat to the rules-based international order the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine poses. They have demonstrated this powerfully by showing solidarity with Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression and in voting to condemn Russian actions in subsequent UNGA resolutions. I spoke about how, as a development partner, the EU has been present in the Pacific for a long time. The EU is also intensifying its political relationship with the region. In November, so in a couple of weeks from now, we expect signature of the Samoa Agreement, which will deepen our political exchanges and which will bring with it a high-level visit from Brussels to the region, underpinning our long-lasting cooperation with this agreement that for the first time will be signed in the Pacific. This comes on top of already existing significant political engagement with the Pacific Island countries through regular bilateral political dialogues at senior official level, and of course, as a dialogue partner of the Pacific Islands Forum, the region's main political organization, as well as the first and so far only permanent observer of the Pacific Community, the main technical and scientific regional organization of the Pacific. Much has been said already on the geopolitical situation in the wider region. On this, we've set out 2 years ago a strategy on cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, the EU's strategy on cooperation with the Pacific. And the title of this strategy says it very clearly. Our emphasis is on cooperation, and we take an inclusive approach. The Pacific does not have to become a theater of increasing geopolitical tension. Our aim should be to respect the sovereignty and sustainable development needs of all, with the EU as a reliable partner. The European Union's relations with the Indo-Pacific region are based on strong historical, cultural, and commercial ties, and decades of significant cooperation and assistance. In this context, the EU will deepen its engagement and reinforce its role as a reliable partner, bringing added value to a long-standing relation with all its partners in the region. This includes like-minded partners, such as the United States, Australia, Japan, Korea, but of course also New Zealand. It also includes pursuing our multifaceted engagement with China, which we consider as an economic competitor, a systemic rival, and a negotiating partner with closely aligned objectives and area of common interest, with whom we can engage bilaterally to promote solutions to common challenges, cooperating on issues of common interest, and encouraging China to play its part in a peaceful and thriving Indo-Pacific region. To conclude, the European Union will continue and intensify its presence and engagement in the Pacific, building on its work as a trusted development partner and as a partner in political dialogue. The challenges faced by the Pacific are global challenges and require cooperation, not confrontation. In line with our Indo-Pacific strategy, we will deepen our engagement with partners in the Indo-Pacific to respond to the emerging dynamics that are affecting regional stability. Our approach is designed to foster a rules-based international order, a level playing field, as well as an open and fair environment for trade and investment, tackling climate change, and supporting connectivity. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you very much, Ambassador Obermaier, for that contribution, which again will be placed on the website. I was to have called High Commissioner Taliaferro, the Independent State of Samoa's High Commissioner to New Zealand, as the next speaker, but unfortunately at the last minute, the Samoan High Commissioner has had to withdraw from the discussion. Ambassador Taliaferro has asked me to convey his apologies to all other participants. So I now call upon the Honourable Gerry Brownlee, MP, member of the New Zealand Parliament and opposition spokesperson on foreign affairs.
Well, thank you, Sir Jim. Can I acknowledge you and your work in working alongside Waikato University and others to bring this seminar together. Can I acknowledge my co-contributors, the ambassadors from China, United States and the EU, and to all of those who might be going to speak afterwards as well. The title of today's seminar, China and the Challenge of the Pacific, is part of a series of seminar Project for Peaceful Competition, is, I think, very timely and of great interest to New Zealand. New Zealand, I might point out, is the home of the Pacific's largest concentrated population of Pacific Islanders or their diaspora in the city of Auckland. And we have, as a country, benefited enormously from the workforce that has come to New Zealand from the Pacific Islands. And there is a two-way aspect to that that makes our relationship as a country to the many countries, in our view, quite special. And I see the challenges for Pacific governments as three things: economic independence, climate change, of course, and then quality social services. You could add many things under each of those various titles. But Pacific Island leaders essentially want for their people what we all want for people who live in free societies: prosperity, good health and education, law and order, good housing, and full employment. Relatively simple things when considered in the heady world of diplomacy. Underlying the renewed interest in the Pacific is part of the reshape of the geopolitical landscape across the world. And how we react to this and how it plays out in the Pacific is our challenge. The question then becomes, how do we capture the current significant interest in the Pacific to strengthen responses to challenges faced by Pacific governments? The current perceived or speculated tensions, or real in some people's minds, between the US and China for dominance in the Pacific serves, if it serves any purpose, then I hope it will be to heighten the awareness of how difficult life can be on many of the Pacific Islands. I prefer to see what might be called tensions at this point as more of a cultural, economic, and environmental challenge rather than potential grounds for conflict. So notwithstanding the history of various warfare actions in World War II, I'm not one who lives in fear of either militarization of the Pacific or potentially devastating consequences from any full-on conflict between the US and China that might be played out in the Pacific. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be vigilant and aware of the shifts in the world's geopolitics. That shift is seen in the decline of the United Nations Authority, the expansion of the BRICS countries, the failure of the G7 to condemn Russia for its illegal invasion of the Ukraine, and even in the current diplomatic standoff between India and China. The Pacific is not isolated from these changes. So it does require an understanding of how the geopolitical shifts and repositioning that will bring could affect the Pacific. I note that this conference takes place, as Sir Jim mentioned earlier, as Pacific leaders are having a second meeting in Washington with President Biden and the US administration. Similar gatherings have occurred in Beijing, and China has facilitated other meetings inside the Pacific. These meetings follow the offers made to Pacific governments, essentially by China and then countered by the United States. Some of the multiple initiatives on offer from China have caused concern from outside the Pacific, most particularly policing and other security matters. But perhaps the most attractive offer from China is the thousands of educational opportunities it's willing to provide. Pacific nations will find it very hard to decline those. While each of the island nations has its own strong culture, these cultures are significantly augmented by Western democratic values and structures. Education on a large scale in a different culture may over time change things. I've heard it said that after infrastructure aid projects have been installed in the Pacific, they often follow three phases. First, it gets built, then it breaks down, and there's limited repair, and finally, there's abandonment and replacement. This is because the skills in many island countries, the skill base is too small to maintain some modern infrastructure. Education from trades and technicians through to advanced degrees is very attractive to island governments, but so too is the retention of those skilled individuals in their home countries. Provision of greater educational opportunities and rewards in the home countries is a challenge we should be giving serious thought. The rules-based system, as mentioned by the two previous speakers, has served the free world very well since the Second World War. And many other countries now willingly embrace those concepts and have joined organisations that give life to those rules. The greatest threat to those rules and the rules-based system could be the consequence of Russia's illegal invasion of the Ukraine. The action alone is clear as a breach of understanding of what's been the norm for recognising territorial boundaries. Consequential multiple sanctions and financial isolation brought down by countries opposed to Russia's invasion is having an effect on almost all economies in various ways. It's also seen Russia seeking support in both arms and money from a number of African countries where stability is fragile and the rule of law limited. However, the rules-based system, I think, is still worth preserving and worth developing further. Those rules can be of great value to the Pacific. They are small economies that need to develop away from their current heavy dependence on remittances and foreign aid. This is no small challenge. It's the rules-based system that could offer opportunities for new technologies to enable greater enhancing of Pacific resources for Pacific nations. A good example of this is the annual losses from unregulated, unreported, illegal fishing in the Pacific. A cost seemed to be close to $1 billion New Zealand dollars a year. And that sum is a multiple of many of the island's current individual debt commitments. If nations who expressed concern about debt traps and other financial entanglements were to assist in the capture of that loss, then some of the concerns about indebtedness in the Pacific might fall to one side. Debt is always a problem for small countries, and it always leads to consequences for those countries that others may not wish to see happen. I make the point that recently much has been made of Tonga's national debt. Post their cyclone, they needed to access significant capital to rebuild what was a fairly much devastated country. And yes, they've taken loans from China. They've done that over a period of years, and some of those loans are called for repayment in the next 12 months. The quantum of debt from all sources is, not in my opinion, a huge problem. It's a significant proportion of Tongan GDP, around about $200 million US, and that is a big challenge for Tonga. But considering building any infrastructure in New Zealand generally starts in the billions, it would seem a manageable amount. The huge amount of aid money available in the Pacific from the many donor countries may be in part better deployed in debt relief, freeing funding for island governments' other priorities. Remember that infrastructure has been the reason for most of the debts being incurred, and that infrastructure is largely built at the choice of the Pacific Island governments because they can see that need. So hand-wringing about China filling a vacuum when other sources of funding were not on offer, I think is pointless, particularly when the money may well be available to complete, albeit currently held in various countries' aid budgets. Perhaps it's time for a Pacific Development Bank that could assist in this particular way. I employed the concept of peaceful competition, as mentioned at the start of the seminar. Can I say the trade with China has, with the rest of the world, reached a level of some $7 trillion, an enormous sum. It's led to 143 countries having China as their major trading partner. It means that the interaction with China by so many nations is now critical to the success of their economies. One of the questions that is raised about China and the challenge in the Pacific is the issue of trust. Trust between nations is important. Trust between those who subscribe to the rules-based system is absolutely essential. And I think it's too easy to rely on speculation that it's a lack of trust that is causing the angst about China. It's worth noting that the $7 trillion two-way trade, while facilitated by government-to-government trade agreements, is not directly conducted by governments, but by individual traders, both in China and throughout the world. That trade is substantially conducted on the basis of trust. So there's a very clear people-to-people level of trust that I think should be recognised in considering any positioning of what the current interests that China or the US have in the Pacific. Looking specifically at the Pacific Islands Forum, looking specifically at the Pacific and the Pacific Islands Forum, it is an organisation that was put together so that Pacific leaders would have some voice in discussions with their larger counterparts, Australia and New Zealand. It has both those countries to the south, Micronesia to the north, but in the centre of the Pacific, there are some 10 countries that number a population of only 2.3 million people. Very, very small populations on a number of those islands. So the economic challenge for them is extremely acute. The forum is an important body for those smaller voices to be heard. For a time, I think the importance of the forum was not well recognised, certainly not as well recognised as it should be or was originally intended. But if the concept of the Blue Pacific continent is to get legs, the forum needs to be enabled to be supported as the driver of that initiative. My notes have just changed a bit here. So can I conclude by saying that competition for influence and presence in the Pacific is not going to go away. The intentions that have been expressed by all of the speakers prior to me today, I think very encouraging for what may become a better outlook for many of those Pacific nations in the future. Corralling all of that good intention, I think, is important. A regional voice, given support, for coercive influence from all parties who are members of the forum, I think will strengthen its calls for the need of all Pacific nations to be seen, heard, and answered. So can I conclude by saying that perhaps the question we should be thinking about today is not so much China and the challenge of the Pacific, as it could be the place of China, the US, and others in meeting the challenges of the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the Honourable Gerry Brownlee, for that contribution and for injecting some further issues into the discussion and debate, which will be reflected in the way that it's reported in due course on the website. Before I move to the second session, I should say that to ensure that all issues are properly and fairly canvassed, I will allow any of those participants who have already spoken to reply very briefly to anything said by another participant, but not, I emphasize, to open up any new issues. This is only intended as a brief right of reply. If any participant wants to exercise that brief right of reply, please raise your hand in the Zoom facility for that purpose. In any event, that offer will remain open for the remainder of the proceedings. I now move to the second session, where we have four speakers, starting with Professor Robert Patman, Director of International Studies at the University of Otago. Professor Patman.
Tēnā koutou katoa. First of all, big thank you to Professor Al Gillespie and Sir Jim McLay for putting this session together. It's been very stimulating. I'd like to divide my presentation into two, some brief comments on the stimulating presentations we've heard, but also I'd then like to speak about the intersection between New Zealand, the Indo-Pacific, and also the Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, because I do think, although our focus is on the Pacific, these events are interconnected, and I think it's important that we take stock. Like Gerry Brownlee, I was encouraged by the contributions from our ambassadors. The Chinese ambassador noted that China does not see itself engaged in geopolitical competition with the United States or anyone else. He also indicated that he did not think China approached international affairs from a zero-sum position. And the United States ambassador also rejected what he called Cold War narratives, and quite rightly said that the 21st century is a completely different context. And also put the focus on peaceful competition, the battle of ideas to influence the Pacific Islands region. And the EU ambassador, I thought, made a really important point that we have got a level of much greater external engagement now in the Pacific Islands region, which must be a good thing for the states themselves. And it's important that their development needs are defined by themselves. That is, they have agency in this process. And it seems to me that one of the things that flows from some of these presentations is that the Pacific Island states will not necessarily we have no evidence to suggest that is happening at the moment, but should any external power wish to impose some sort of great power competition scenario, they will not necessarily be interested in the outcome. Their major concern is clearly issues such as climate change, which represents a very real physical threat to their existence. And finally, I thought Gerry Brownlee made some important points on the New Zealand role in the Pacific. We have a large Pacific population, as he pointed out. And in addition, I think New Zealand often describes itself as a small state, but I think it may also have to think of itself as a bit of a minor power. Not only does New Zealand share with many of the other speakers a commitment to uphold the rules international rules-based system. But I think New Zealand can add something quite distinctive here in contributing to the strengthening of the rules-based order. And that is something that all New Zealand governments, going back to Peter Fraser immediately after the Second World War, has been committed to. So I think there's a role there for New Zealand and can bring quite a distinctive contribution on strengthening the international rules-based order. Now, let me just talk briefly about what I see as the intersection between New Zealand, the Indo-Pacific, and Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And if you want a quick takeaway, I would put it in this way. New Zealand's strategic priority in the Indo-Pacific, which of course includes the Pacific Islands region, is not AUKUS, but helping to defeat the Putin invasion of Ukraine. The Putin's regime's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has had a huge impact on the Indo-Pacific region. Other speakers have already referred to the threat that this invasion represents to the international rules-based order. Now, these effects have been both economic and diplomatic, and whoever forms the next New Zealand government after the October the 14th faces the challenge of more clearly, I think, addressing some of the strategic consequences that flowed from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. AUKUS, which includes the United States, the UK, and Australia, seems to be based on the assumption that it will deter or at least counter China's perceived assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region and its potential threat to the international rules-based system. But it's unclear whether this arrangement would necessarily advance the core national interests of New Zealand. While I think government documents have quite accurately and rightly argued that New Zealand's stability, security and prosperity depends critically on an international rules-based order. On that, I don't think there's much dispute in New Zealand. It's also plain that China is not the sole or even the most serious threat to that order. The capitals of the Indo-Pacific region have been closely monitoring the invasion of Ukraine, and given the sensitivity to sovereignty concerns, many Southeast Asian states in particular supported the UN resolution of 2nd of March 2022 condemning Mr. Putin's so-called special military operation. However, only Singapore, a close US ally, has imposed sanctions on Russia, and generally ASEAN statements on the invasion have not criticized Moscow directly. For Indonesia and many other Southeast Asian states, the Russian assault on Ukraine has led to soaring prices for food and energy and a more polarized international environment. It should be pointed out that ASEAN countries are major wheat importers and have been deeply affected by the conflict that's been unfolding between Russia and Ukraine. Meanwhile, many states in the Indo-Pacific are conscious not only of the growing prices of food and fuel, but they're also conscious that regional heavyweights, in fact, global heavyweights in the case of China, but also regional heavyweights like India remain important partners of Moscow. China has abstained on crucial UN resolutions condemning Russian actions in the Ukraine, repeatedly placing the blame for the conflict on NATO, and has massively expanded trade with Russia since the start of the invasion. Military ties between China and Russia continue to deepen. The two states have held joint military exercises, amongst other things, and the PRC has reportedly supplied components to Iran in 2023 for use in drones being sold to Russia. While the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been more overtly critical than Xi Jinping of Russia's Ukraine invasion, he continues to emphasize close diplomatic and military ties with Russia. As a third area of concern for Indo-Pacific countries in respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, While many Indo-Pacific countries will be aware that the Biden administration has directed more than $75 billion in financial and military assistance to support Ukraine's fight against Russia, NATO has further expanded its membership, and there's been a range of comprehensive and collective sanctions targeting the Russian economy. However, I think many of these countries may yet still question the staying power behind this American effort. When I say American, it's not exclusively a United States effort. Of course, Germany, Britain, a number of other countries, including New Zealand, but also Australia and Canada, have played a big part in trying to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty. However, the question mark about staying power flows from the fact that the Biden administration has sometimes tried not to provoke Putin's regime in supporting the defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, measuring out the provision of weapons rather than sort of helping Ukraine to rigorously attempt to win the war. Also, it must be pointed out, and this won't be lost in many capitals in the Indo-Pacific, that many international supporters of Ukraine include those that champion a land for peace deal with Mr. Putin, that the idea that Ukraine should give up some of its territory for some sort of deal with the authoritarian regime in Moscow. And, of course, another factor that is also being weighed in Indo-Pacific capitals, as well as in other countries, is the possibility that a new Republican administration may come to power in 2024, and that might change American policy towards the Ukraine. In the circumstances, I think it's important that New Zealand remain very clear-eyed about the linkage between its strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific region and also the necessity of defeating Putin's expansionism in Ukraine. To date, New Zealand has contributed more than 70 million in humanitarian military aid, but the aid effort to a liberal democracy that gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 and shares New Zealand's goal of reforming the United Nations Security Council looks pretty modest, given the scale of the possible fallout for the Indo-Pacific region if Mr. Putin gets any sort of victory in Ukraine. The best way for New Zealand, in my view, to contribute to strengthening the rules-based order is to significantly increase its military support for President Zelensky's government in Kyiv. If Mr. Putin's army is defeated or forced to withdraw from Ukraine, it will be, I believe, a step in strengthening the rules-based order. If Mr. Putin derives any victory, then I think there will be grave concerns about the viability and the staying power of that international rules-based order. And so I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Patman, for those enlightening comments, which, again, will be recorded and placed on the website as part of the proceedings of this virtual conference. I now call on Dr. Anna Powles of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at Massey University, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Dr. Powles.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for having me this evening, and a particular thanks to Professor Gillespie and Sir Jim McLay and obviously to the other speakers as well. It's been a fascinating time listening to the various speeches, presentations given so far. And before I start mine, I'll just begin by noting that one of the references to peaceful competition, but also the reference to how to capture the current interest, and the focus on all the various different actors who are re-engaging and engaging more deeply in the Pacific does actually raise the question, which the EU ambassador neatly noted with respect to the question itself of this forum, which was the challenge of the Pacific, but what the challenge, what the challenge issued by the Pacific actually is. And I think I'm going to return to that shortly, because I would argue that challenge issued by the Pacific also calls for better and improved coordination and cooperation amongst partners as well. And as we've seen here this evening, for me in Washington this evening, there's a great deal of activity, an increase in tempo taking place. So I would like to begin by saying that the focus of what I would like to talk about, and the way that I have taken the question of the challenge to the Pacific, is actually the challenge posed by strategic competition and the dynamic relationship between geopolitics and regional order that has resulted as a consequence of strategic competition, which, as we know, has intensified in the Pacific since 2014. And we're seeing a level of dynamism between external interests and Pacific sovereignty and agency in a way that we haven't really seen since the 1960s, the period of decolonization particularly, but also sort of re-emerged in the early 2000s. Now, for many Pacific leaders, this tension and this dilemma between these intersecting concerns are first that, and I quote here, that the big powers are doggedly pursuing strategies to widen and extend their reach and inculcating a far-reaching sense of insecurity in the region. Secondly, a deep frustration that the region is being pressured to choose between a China alternative and our traditional partners at the expense of development imperatives and Pacific calls for climate action. And thirdly, that Pacific approaches to managing strategic competition at both the national and regional levels are increasingly being tested. And in essence, that Pacific states in the region are increasingly being faced with a strategic choice not of their making. And that's very much what I'd like to focus on now, is that tension between that geopolitical and Pacific regionalism. It's noteworthy that the Pacific Islands Forum inaugural Security Outlook report, which was released earlier this year, describes an increasingly contested region with the United States and its allies seeking to maintain, I quote here, the regional dominance they've held since the colonial era, and China seeking to advance its own strategic agenda. The contemporary Pacific regional order is a confluence and increasingly contest of three dynamics: Pacific-led narratives and priorities driven by the Blue Pacific narrative, the interests and agendas of the former and ongoing colonial powers in the region, as well as new development partners, too, all of whom, since 2017, have developed strategic frameworks to frame their increasing engagement with the Pacific, and also China, of course, who is not a new partner in the region by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly since 2014 has substantially increased its engagement, which led to, in 2022, a proposed Chinese-led alternative regional architecture. So the first of those three is the Blue Pacific Regional Order, driven by the Pacific Islands Forum, articulated in the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, adopted in 2022. And it was advanced in 2017 and emphasizes the agency's strategic autonomy and activism of Pacific countries, as well as the importance of the region's own security architecture in the changing regional order. The Blue Pacific Regional Order builds on the success of collective action, including the 1985 Treaty of Rarotonga, which created the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, and more recently, collective success in the spheres of international climate diplomacy and oceans governance. And we saw that very recently in New York last week. It captures what is known as the New Pacific Diplomacy, which reflected a fundamental shift around 2009 in the way Pacific states engaged in regional and international affairs, in part driven by frustration with Western dominance of regional institutions, as well as the established regional order and the desire to exercise their autonomy and influence. This content fueled regional dynamics, including those which drove the fracturing of the Pacific Islands Forum in 2021. The Blue Pacific Regional Order is also reflected in the Pacific Security Agenda advanced by the Forum 2018 Boy Declaration on Regional Security. And Similarly, the narrative also strategically seeks to influence the policies of the region's partners, a practiced strategy amongst small states by advancing and promoting regional order narratives, such as the Blue Pacific narrative. Pacific Island countries aim to influence the foreign policy behavior of their partners in other states by shaping their perceptions and guiding their policy choices. And this has largely been successful. Which brings me to the second dynamic. Partner countries have responded, as we've heard this evening, with enthusiasm to re-engaging with the Pacific, to the Blue Pacific narrative, particularly embracing the legitimacy it affords their engagement and aligning their development priorities with the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, including some appropriation of the narrative itself and adopting the rhetoric of forum centrality, even when the Blue Pacific narrative and forum centrality have been circumvented and undermined. Within this dynamic, Pacific Island Forum member countries, New Zealand and Australia, have sought to, not always successfully, strategically shape partner engagement in the region. As the tempo of partner engagement has increased, Wellington and Canberra particularly have sought to safeguard and cultivate their own interests, including their own centrality and credibility within the regional order through the promotion of the Blue Pacific narrative and forum centrality, and by leveraging their perceived and assumed influence in the region. And this strategy is not without its risks. And we see some of those risks playing out in the providence of the Partners in the Blue Pacific initiative, launched in 2022. The third dynamic is the alternative regional order advanced by China in 2022. As we know, that prior to the China Pacific Islands countries foreign ministers meeting, China proposed the China Pacific Islands Common Development Vision, with the aim of the draft communique being adopted at the foreign ministers meeting. The Common Development Vision sought to reshape the regional order in the Pacific Islands through the advancement and close alignment of ambitious security and economic initiatives. It proposed substantial trade and investment initiatives, including a China-Pacific Islands Free Trade Area, aligned the Belt and Road Initiative with the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, and proposed numerous security sector initiatives, from law enforcement, elevating law enforcement cooperation to ministerial levels, cybersecurity, smart customs, data networks, and so forth. Despite the rejection of the Common Development Vision by Pacific leaders, it reflected Chinese ambitions to build an alternative regional architecture in the Pacific. These ambitions are being realized in the context of security cooperation and in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. China's announcement for the first time that it is a direct stakeholder in the security of the Pacific has been followed with security and policing arrangements, most notably with Solomon Islands, including the Security Deal 2022, and also through the building of defense and security attaches networks and security infrastructure. Now, of course, a number of these initiatives are welcomed by China's Pacific partners. However, where the concerns lie is that China's alternative security architecture could potentially cut across and undermine the existing peaceful regional security, Pacific regional security architecture, including existing crisis management mechanisms, such as the Pacific Islands Forum 2000 Bikatawa Declaration, which provided the mandate for the Australian-led intervention in Solomon Islands in 2003. And this is where the concerns for many of us lie, is the tension between that strategic competition, the tension is taking place in countries on the ground. And China's emergence as a security partner in Solomon Islands, alongside Australia, who has long been the preferred security partner of choice, has revealed the risks of strategic competition intersecting with local security dynamics. And the danger here, of course, is that what the Pacific countries have been calling for a very long time, cooperation, if not collaboration, but certainly cooperation. We certainly need to see that in the space of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And as China seeks a role as a humanitarian responder and key stakeholder in disaster responses in the Pacific, as witnessed in response to the Tongan eruption and tsunami in 2022, albeit outside the existing regional humanitarian architecture and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief architecture, more work obviously needs to be done to ensure that we do not have two parallel Haydar architectures in the Pacific. Pacific countries have responded to the competing visions of the regional order by consistently stating that they prefer a regional order that is characterized neither by US nor Chinese hegemony. There are certainly contrasting stances between those Pacific members of the non-aligned movement and those Pacific countries closely aligned with the United States. However, as a result of strategic competition in the Pacific, a broad consensus has emerged amongst Pacific states. It is driven by two demands. First, as I said before, that partners cooperate rather than compete. And secondly, that Pacific interests and priorities shape and drive the regional security agenda. This has led to Pacific states hedging the US, its allies and partners, and China. It has also led to Pacific states making strategic choices, at times under pressure. The lesson here is that national interest and regional dynamism paints a complex picture of Pacific agency, which is frequently poorly understood. In the last few years, a third element of the Pacific consensus has emerged. This is one of recognition that strategic competition is directly impacting regional politics and security, and this is specifically stated in the 2050 strategy. This includes reducing the strategic autonomy of Pacific states, advanced in the Blue Pacific narrative, and growing concerns that despite partner support, both rhetorical and material, for peace and security in the region, competition is leading to militarization, suggesting that foreign policy stances such as friends to all and enemies to none are no longer sufficient for managing strategic competition, as well as calls to advance a collective security treaty in order to better manage asymmetrical relations and balance external powers. To conclude here, the current Pacific regional order is one of increasingly of competition and coercion at a time when the Pacific region is still in the process of state and nation building. The ability of the Pacific to navigate and manage strategic competition in the future is murky, certainly. Arguably, strengthening existing approaches to collective security by building on existing declarations and extant strategic mechanisms and enshrining collective security principles would benefit the Pacific and strengthen regionalism. The face of the Pacific regional order will look very different over the next decade as it evolves. The leaders of the post-independence era with strong ties to the region's traditional partners will be replaced by the next generation of leaders who may not share those same ties. Regionalism itself will evolve as non-state actors, local norms, and informal practices continue to shape the Pacific. The role that the Pacific Islands Forum will play in the evolving regional order is by no means a given. Equally importantly, as partners seek to increase their engagement with the Pacific and to position themselves as preferred partners integrated into the regional order, greater effort must be taken to ensure that geopolitics does not exacerbate local security dynamics and that engagement is constructive rather than disruptive. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Powles, for that contribution coming if I calculate correctly, quite late at night in Washington, D.C. So thank you for your participation. I now call upon Professor Steven Ratuva, the Director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies at the University of Canterbury. Professor Ratuva.
Well, thanks so much, Sir Jim. I would like to acknowledge the presence here of the ambassadors of the People's Republic of China, the United States, European Union, and the Honourable Gerry Brownlee, and also my colleagues who've spoken earlier, Robert and Anna. They've said everything that I wanted to say. So I've been watching and listening with very a lot of interest in relation to the presentations, and it's not often that you have the ambassadors of China and the United States together in the same session discussing their different geopolitical interests in this part of the world, in the Pacific, and certainly learn a lot in terms of what's happening in the minds of the big powers. And that's certainly the question which is raised by the Pacific Island people themselves in relation to what exactly is happening around us, how they're thinking about us, and what kind of leverage are they using as a means of winning our loyalty. I'll probably look at things from the point of view of what the European ambassador brilliantly referred to as the Pacific Island Agency, because I think it's very, very important to understand where they fit into the big power dynamics. Certainly, what's happening now it's nothing new. If you look at the historical development of geopolitics in the Pacific since the end of the Cold War, I did a presentation the other day, was it 2 days ago, online for conference taking place in Wellington. I couldn't get there because of the fact I was quite busy. I tried to categorize the period between now and the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War, into 4 phases altogether. The first was the Cold War contestation between the Soviet Union and the United States, of course. There was, a period when the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty was created and signed by the island countries in the Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand. And it was a period of decolonization as well, and nuclear testing in the Pacific. And phase 2 was, if you like, the post-Cold War war on terror scenario, where the security framing of the Pacific, particularly by Australia and the United States, was geared towards the potential so-called Islamic terrorism in this part of the world, and the rise of terms such as arc of instability, referring to the Pacific, and so forth, and Australia's cooperative intervention strategy. And then the phase 3, I talk about the emergence of China as a power in this part of the world, and of course the West's response, and the contestation between the 2 major blocs, the Belt and Road, and the US pivot to Asia, the Pacific under Obama, and Australia's step-up policy, and New Zealand is reset and changed to resilience. Australia changed from step-up to Vuvale, and the United Kingdom, its uplift policy, and Indonesia elevate, and a number of island states in the region, the look north policy. So different kinds of policy framing in relation to not just economic development, also in relation to security. And then I mentioned that what we have now is the, if you like, the Indo-Pacific phase, the shift from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific, the incorporation of India into the picture, and so forth. So from the point of view of the Pacific Island states, they're wondering, now what's happening here? There have been a lot of shifts in the geopolitical areas of contestation, different players. With the Indo-Pacific, for instance, there are 2 aspects, 2 components of it. One is the Quad, consisting of Japan, India, and the United States, and Australia. And then you have the AUKUS, consisting of the United Kingdom, Australia, and the US. So in the last few months, last few years, the Pacific Island leaders have been asking what is there in it for us in relation to security, which is part of the narrative of selling the Indo-Pacific concept in the region. So listening to the discussion is quite interesting, not only in terms of the areas of commonalities, particularly in terms of the some of the narratives of security. I note that in the case of China, the notions of equality, openness, and cooperation. In the case of the United States, open, free, prosperous, and secure. And the European Union as well, open and fair. So there's a lot of commonalities in terms of some of the languages coming out. I suppose the question which I want to pose here is what exactly do those terms mean? For instance, when you talk about openness, all of them use the word openness. What exactly does it mean? Certainly, it has a political, ideological meaning behind it. In the case of China, in the case of the United States, certainly the European Union as well. And from the point of view of the Pacific Island Agency, what does it mean in terms of openness? Does it open up the Pacific to anyone who passes by and imposes its security agenda? Or is it based on the idea of allowing the Pacific to be a place of peaceful engagement open engagement between the powers? I remember in 2010, 2010 and 2011, Mrs. Clinton, who was Secretary of State then, who visited the Pacific as well, and around that period, talk about the Pacific being big enough for everybody with China and the United States. And China responded in kind. They also mentioned that, yes, certainly the Pacific is big enough for everybody. Now, when you read the speeches of coming out of Clinton, as well as the from China, Minister of Foreign Affairs in China, it is as if the same speechwriter was writing the two speeches. So certainly from the point of view of the Pacific Island states, what does it mean in terms of their sovereignty? What does it mean in terms of their security? What does it mean in terms of their development agenda? Now, often when we talk about the Pacific, we talk about, we assume a generic entity, when in fact it's quite complex, not only in terms of the number of states involved, the Forum, the South Pacific Commission, which is a bit larger in terms of the number of countries. And if you include, well, Hawaii is part of the United States. If you go beyond just the Pacific Island Forum boundary, then it gets bigger and bigger. Now, we can look at the Pacific in terms of three layers. One is the island states themselves, who have a long history of connections in terms of culture, in terms of genealogical connections, which extends as far as the Maoris in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that has been there for thousands of years as the ancestors of the Pacific Islanders traverse the largest ocean in the world. And then you have the second layer, which is New Zealand and Australia. They're part of the Pacific, they're part of the Forum, but they're also donors. They're also big economically large countries and politically powerful countries engaging in the region. So they're part of the Forum at the same time. They have strong links with external powers. Australia, for instance, through AUKUS and through the Indo-Pacific framework. And the third layer are the big powers like China and the United States, and we're listening to them today, which is quite interesting. And their perception of the first layer of the Pacific Island countries. And of course, all these layers are interconnected in different ways, geopolitically, in terms of the security narratives, and so forth. But what I suppose distinguishes the layers in the context of what we're discussing today is their actual security interests and security understanding of the world. To the first layer, the Pacific Island countries, their most immediate security consideration is really climate change. It's really to do with the fact that much of the island is beginning to be inundated, the destruction of the reefs as a result of the warming of the sea and erosion and Category 5 cyclones, and they're facing the all these issues all the time. And that's where I think things become very, very interesting in terms of the gap between, if you like, the Pacific Island states and the big powers who we've heard, from them today. Now, one of the ways in which the Pacific Island states see themselves as being significant is how they perceive diplomatic engagement as a way of winning their loyalty, winning their support for the particular geopolitical interests of the big powers. And aid is indeed one of the ways in which this is done. The Chinese have been giving aid for a number of years. In fact, almost every public buildings all around the Pacific have been donated by China. As I mentioned earlier by Mr. Brownlee, a lot of those have disintegrated as a result of the rather poor quality of the aid given, and a lot of money is being spent trying to repair them. On the other hand, countries like Australia and New Zealand as well give aid which often finds its way back to the donor countries. One of the terms used is boomerang aid, because a lot of the money goes into the pockets of the contractors. If you see the aid into the Pacific in the last, say, 50 years, there's been a tremendous increase over time. But if you consider the level of poverty has been increasing as well, and health conditions have been worsening, and also the well-being of the people. There's no direct correlation between the amount of aid which is given and the improvement of people's well-being. There are a number of reasons for that. I've given you one. One is that a lot of the aid comes back to the donor countries, and that's something which not only Australian aid, not only New Zealand aid, Chinese aid as well, because a lot of aid is in the form of loan, soft loan, which goes back to Exim Bank. And China uses its own personnel, sometimes locally as well, and a lot of the money goes back to China. So, and also because a lot of aid is wrapped up in geopolitical dressing, and that makes it much more difficult to look through. So, so in terms of the developmental aspect of relationship between the big powers and the Pacific Island states, the result on the ground is different from what the rhetoric within the political space talks about. While the narrative talks about collaboration and development, what happens on the ground is very different. Now, let me also connect this to the 2050 Blue Pacific strategy. Now, the 2050 Blue Pacific strategy was put together as a way of affirming the future vision of the Pacific people in relation to development, in relation to inclusivity and equity, governance, education, research, technology, resilience, well-being, and partnership. These are the, if you like, the 5 visions of the 2050 document. But I think what has happened in the last couple of years and months is the way in which this document has been used by the big powers, both the US and China, as a way of connecting, as well as seeing themselves as part of the implementers, funders for the future, which is something raises a number of issues in relation to the sovereignty of small island states. In fact, they're big ocean states, not small island states. The sovereignty and the autonomy in terms of determining the trajectory of their development into the future. And I think some of the narratives which are coming out of the presentation of the 2 ambassadors from China and the United States have to do with the respect for sovereignty. I think this is where it should be used. So the gap between, if you like, the geopolitical, geostrategic narrative and application of that on the ground is very, very significant. Application in terms of how it makes sense to the Pacific Island states. Now, the last point I want to raise here is to do with working together. I noticed that the Chinese ambassador and the American ambassador talking about potential for working together. And I think that's great in relation to how can they promote peace in the region by working together. Competition is good, but often competition can also lead to contestation. And competition, economic and political, ideological competition, can also lead to contestation, which can be negative as well. So the implications and the consequences of that competition on the Pacific Island states is something that we have to be wary about, because those consequences can lead to things which we don't foresee. Now, so I was very interested in the position of the European Union, because it appears that the European Union presentation by the ambassador positions itself in between the two. And in fact, I noted down in the note which I was writing while listening is the European Union referee can be a referee between the two in terms of bringing them together, in terms of providing a space for commonality. And that's precisely what the Pacific needs in terms of moving forward. It's not so much competition whose consequences can be destructive, but rather cooperation, which can be for the benefit of everyone, not only the two major powers, but also the Pacific Island states, whose security interests are not so much to do with geopolitics, but to do with issues of development, issues of poverty, of well-being, of health, of education. These are, and of course, climate crisis, the climate change that we are facing now. So those are the issues which they are facing. And this competition with geopolitical purposes can actually undermine and overshadow and even worsen some of those human security issues which are being faced by the Pacific Island states every day in the way they run the countries. So I will stop there. What I've basically tried to do was to pick bits and pieces from the discussion, because a lot of what I wanted to say earlier have been covered by my two colleagues, Robert and Anna. So basically trying to pull together a few pieces from the presentations, earlier presentations, and how perhaps we can work together in the Pacific to move from competition and contestation into peaceful engagement and coexistence. Thank you so much.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Al Gillespie. I'm also the hamster in the wheel that's been running around for the last year trying to help pull this together. But nothing would have been possible without Jim, Oliver, Clem, Fetu, the high-level dignitaries that have come today to speak to us, my colleagues, my academic colleagues. I just want to say thank you to all of you. To my mind, nothing is more important right now than the quest for peace, and wherever we can advance that, it's critical. I'm going to try to tie together a few themes, but as Steven was bemoaning before me that he was finding it hard to pick up pieces after both Anna and Robert had spoken following the four ambassadors, I'm now after Steven. And so the chances for originality are near zero. So I'm just going to speak about where I see a few considerations. My interest in this area began when I was in Samoa a few years ago, and I went for a run one morning, and I was on Apia Harbour, and there was a plaque about a cyclone that arrived in 1889. And this cyclone took out 6 of 7 sloops, which were kind of like one-level warships. 3 were German, 3 were American. The British one survived. It's rare that a cyclone is a welcome thing in the Pacific, but this one particular cyclone potentially stopped a conflict because both the Americans and the Germans were backing different contenders over constitutional debate over dynasty in Samoa. It ultimately didn't end up good for Samoa. Samoa got divided between America and Germany in a subsequent deal. But it did tell me something, that this interest of the external world in geopolitical competition in the Pacific is not new. It goes back to the 19th century. It's gone in phases. The 21st century is different to where we are now. The challenge is perhaps greater. But the irony of all this interest of over hundreds of years of focus in the Pacific is that much of it remains significantly underdeveloped. When I see the underdevelopment, it's not just the economic situation, it's the vulnerability, it's their social challenges, it's a plethora of concerns that we have to address as the international community. There are 46 least developed countries in this world, and these aren't just poor places, these are the poorest of the poor. 4 of the LDCs are in the Pacific. 2 of them, Samoa and Vanuatu, are just above the LDC line. And for decades, they have been neglected, these countries, and their quest for sustainable development, respect, important resources that they need. And now the world has changed, and it's almost dizzying to try to keep track with how popular some of these leaders of these countries are. It's now a diplomatic dance between Washington and Beijing, where the dance card of many leaders is full and the offers being made are significant. And they've gone from being near invisible on the international stage to now being almost at the center of it. And many people spend our lives trying to work out who's in, who's out, and trying to dissect the very small parts of words and what they may or may not mean. I want to focus on 3 things of where I see the chance for success, where I have a warning light, and where I have a concern. Where I think the chance of success is greatest with the Pacific is over aid or assistance or grants, where we effectively give on a basis where it doesn't need to be repaid. We're at the point where since 2008, over $50 billion, 57,000 projects have been undertaken in the Pacific. The largest grantors are Australia, New Zealand, the United States. China is now also growing quickly in this space. And this is good, but let's be honest, it could be a lot better. What Mr. Brownlee said before about the difficulties and the continuity of aid is true. We've seen these problems not just in the Pacific, but we saw them in the second half of the 20th century in other countries, where you would get 4 water pumps from different providers in the same village in Africa. And it's not just a waste, it's a lost opportunity. If we can have coordinated, aligned, consistent, accountable, and transparent aid, and it's linked to multilateral goals like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Global Climate Fund, we have the chance for progress. It is true that the amount of aid we have given as a percentage of GDP has declined, but there is still a significant amount of cash on the table. And if this is coordinated well, better than it has been traditionally, there is a chance for positive outcomes. Where I have a neutral view is over the question of debt, because one part that we are seeing change is that although aid and multilateral assistance is the dominant feature in the Pacific, increasingly loans are not far behind. This creates a risk. The debt trap is not a new invention. The debt trap of countries goes back over 150 years. And if countries get into debt, their risk is making not only choices where they are beholden to external parties, but also difficult choices that can create challenges in their own types of government. I don't think we're at the stage where it's a crisis, but I do see clouds on the horizon. The World Bank currently identifies 6 high-risk debt-distressed countries in the Pacific region. This could be turned better. The risk could be negated if we focus more on multilateral institutions, if we emphasized aid and grants over loans, and if we worked together. The vulnerability of countries which are poor and beholden to others creates risk for all nations. My third area, and this is one that Anna talked about, is the risk of militarization. And this is where I do see warning lights. One of the upsides of being in the not so visible part of the first Cold War is that not much happened in the Pacific. And that meant that our quest for independence, our focus on being nuclear free, to a degree non-aligned for many countries, was possible. And this was a useful advantage. But in recent times, we have seen a militarization. We see it not just with regards to the obvious places, but we've seen it spill over with regards to the issues of security, maritime security, police security, military security. The lines start to blur between all of these places. We can witness new agreements, recent agreements with PNG, with Vanuatu, with Fiji, with the Solomons, with Timor as well. Some of them go one way, some of them go another. But the trend clearly is that there is a militarization which is occurring. And this is happening in a relatively short space of time. The risk, if there's a flashpoint, is that when you have a constitutional debate in any Pacific country, that two sides support opposing parties. This is a risk that we must seek to avoid at all points. We should strive continually for regional solutions. We should try to build civil security in inclusive, cooperative ways. The risk of trying to pick one side or the other to the exclusion of outsiders is an unpalatable suggestion. So that's it. I'm going to keep it short. What I wanted to say, one, this is part of a long sequence of history. This is just the most recent one where the Pacific is at risk of international geopolitics. The deep history in this area is something we should keep in mind. Two, there's positive prospects for cooperation over aid, assistance, and grants. Three, with the issue of debt, it's neutral, but there are clouds on the horizon. And four, we must strive to avoid the militarization of the region because the risks of that could be catastrophic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al Gillespie, for that contribution, which I think wrapped up many of the issues that are of concern and were raised as matters of concern. It's my task now to draw the threads of this discussion together, to do so in a way that hopefully will be advantageous. I will try not to introduce new matter because we're past that point, and indeed it's difficult to determine what new matter might still be to be tabled. There is an advantage when you ask 8 participants to answer the same question. You get 8 different answers. And that certainly was the experience today. And I think we're all the more valuable an experience for that reason. The Pacific is unquestionably a dynamic region and is becoming more so with the renewed interest. The interest in this region is not new, but it is being differently played out than it was, say, in previous centuries, both 19th and 20th. The issues that were raised were invariably those of the that are frequently heard at the Pacific Forum and at similar meetings throughout the region, and in similar debates and discussions such as this. The emphasis was seemingly all the time on competition, on avoiding conflict, on ensuring that people and people-to-people relationships, trade, and the like were the emphasis, not conflict. Relationships are not just government to government; they are also people to people. Competition will not go away. That was made very clear in a number of the contributions. Even those who didn't really want to see competition, but rather wanted to avoid a Cold War narrative. The relationship must be peaceful. For example, the battle for ideas rather than the experience of conflict on a more significant basis. The significance of history is very important here. Came home to me as well. I was listening particularly to Ambassador Obermaier's contribution, that all of the contributors today represented countries or regions from which people immigrated to the Pacific and settled in this region. In other words, there is a strong and definable relationship between the Pacific and the people who settled it, both the original Polynesians, the original settlers, and those who came after them. There is a need for development partners, both within the region, Australia and New Zealand, beyond the region, the EU, and those who straddle the region, the People's Republic of China and the United States of America are the obvious candidates there. Climate change was mentioned by many participants. The significance of the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change is very important and will continue to be addressed at the Security Council and elsewhere as the Pacific Island countries discover that there are forums that they can adopt and diplomatic methods that they can adopt to ensure that these issues are discussed. There were 5 issues that were raised, which were important, but were not pursued by every participant. And I think I should just list them rather than address them as issues. The first is the significance of the war in Ukraine. There were different perspectives on this, but unquestionably it does have implications for this region, as it does indeed globally. Secondly, there was the need for an alternative. There was the request for an alternative regional order. Only mentioned by 1 or 2, but clearly a matter of importance to those who raised it. Thirdly, geopolitics must not be allowed to exacerbate regional tensions and problems. That is very clear. Not always addressed by every participant in the words that I have just expressed, but nonetheless important. The significance of boomerang aid was the 4th issue that I heard as raised. It's a nice phrase. We've seen it in Africa as well as in the Pacific. It's not new, but it is a matter that is of concern to those who receive aid only to see it spent in the donor country. Debt trap. Only 2 participants raised this, but it is in fact an important issue. The problem and the concern of soft loans that turn into hard debt, and the need to address that as an issue. There may only be 2 or 3 in the region that are presently threatened by such debt, but it is an important issue and will become increasingly important as the level of debt increases. And finally, there was the threat of militarism and the need to avoid that if at all possible. This is not a region that is new to militarism. It saw it in the 1941-45 period, and it has defined much of the Pacific that followed in the years of the Cold War. I could go into great detail on all of the matters that were addressed and discussed, but simply say that this has been an extraordinarily valuable discussion. I thank those who participated today, and in anticipation of those who will be following up by going to the website, I thank you for your interest in these issues. Mararuru koe mana te tawhai wahahi. Thank you for your participation. Kei katia, kei kakoi, e aurua, e reto, e ma'atu kerero. May you find value in our discussions. And I'll call on Petu Takamo to offer a brief few words and a closing karakia.
Kia ora koutou I te iwi, ngā iwi katoa, to everyone, acknowledge those who've been part of this, our proceedings, and close us now. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, kia ta whai o tō tātou ariki e hukraiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhingatahitanga, ki te wairua tapu ake. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.